Hi there. Thanks for tuning in to the Canadian Constitution Foundation's Freedom Update. Today was the fifth day of hearings in the Public Order Emergency Commission, also known as the Rouleau Commission. This is the legally required public inquiry into the federal government's first ever invocation of the Emergencies Act, which was done in response to the 2022 Freedom Convoy. The Commission is examining and assessing the basis for the government's decision to invoke that legislation. In this video, I'll give you a quick summary of some of the things that stood out to me on day 5 of these historic hearings. During this hearing today, there were 2 witnesses, former Ottawa Police Board Chair Diane Deans and OPP Superintendent Pat Morris. I can't wait to tell you all about it. So today there were 2 witnesses. Both of them were related to policing. But first, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Christine and I'm the litigation director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. We're also a party to this inquiry, so we are participating and cross-examining witnesses in this commission. I upload regular videos about our ongoing legal cases, and I'm uploading a series of videos summarizing the proceedings in the Rouleau Commission every day. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please hit like and subscribe below. It really helps my videos out a lot. Also, please remember my videos are not legal advice. If you have your own legal question or problem, please consult your own lawyer. And before getting into what happened today, I want you to keep in mind that this is just my summary of some of the key parts of a full day of hearings, the things that stood out to me as especially interesting and worthy of summarizing in this video. This, though, is not a complete summary of everything that happened. And also, please keep in mind that unless I tell you otherwise, this is not my opinion about the evidence. It's a summary of the evidence. Unless I tell you it's my opinion, which in some cases I will do, I will share my thoughts as well. But I will always let you know that I'm giving you my opinion. This is also just my best recollection based on my observations and notes from watching the hearings. If you want every detail, I recommend watching the hearings themselves or reading the transcripts, which are available on the Commission website. Okay, let's get to the evidence. First up today was former Ottawa Police Board Chair Diane Deans. They started off today with questions about the planning leading up to the protests, and this evidence is interesting when it's compared to the evidence presented by the second witness, OPP Commissioner Morris. So first, Ms. Deans testified that the former Ottawa Chief of Police, Slowly, told her that he would be very surprised if the protesters were still there on Monday after the first weekend. When she raised concerns that they might stay longer, he asked, "What are you so worried about?" She said she was worried about the size of the trucks, the number of them, and how much money they had raised on GoFundMe. But she testified that nevertheless, Chief Slowly told the board that the Ottawa police didn't think very many people would stay past Monday. A lot of Ms. Deans' testimony was sort of about who did what and when during the protest. There was also a lot of testimony related to what you might call, or what I might call in my opinion, like butt covering for various people in Ottawa. This isn't necessarily relevant, though, to the question that I care about the most, which is whether the high legal threshold to invoke the Emergencies Act was actually met. But I'm going to still tell you what happened. Ms. Deans testified that the resource requests, the requests for more officers from Chief Slowly, were not specific enough. She testified that the police were just saying we need more people. There were not details of how many they needed at this point. She said that she actually called a board meeting about that. She also testified that she couldn't understand why the resources from other forces were not coming. She testified that she didn't know about the finger pointing that was going on between the OPP and the RCMP and the issues there. I get into those issues in my videos from some previous days. This all came up from other witnesses' evidence. Ms. Deans testified that eventually, though, Chief Slowly came back with a detailed list of his resource requirements, including details of the officers, the number of the officers and civilians he needed, but that an operational plan, she said, it wasn't well hatched at that point. She also testified that there was a lot of what she described as creative accounting from the OPP and RCMP about how many officers had actually been sent by those forces to deal with the Ottawa demonstrations. She testified a lot of the RCMP officers who had been sent were actually there sent to guard federal properties like the Governor General's residence and the Prime Ministerial cottage. So she said that those didn't actually really help deal with the protests themselves. She also testified that while Chief Sloley had requested 1,800 officers to help clear the protest, the board wasn't briefed on how those officers would fit into Chief Sloley's operational plan. The point of contention, Deans testified, was the need for a solid plan that was resourced, and they didn't have the resources. Deans testified it appeared that the resources were flowing to other areas like Coots a lot faster than they were flowing to Ottawa, and that this was frustrating. Deans was also asked if she suspected there was an association between the delay in getting these resources from the OPP and RCMP and the plan, or lack thereof, that Sloley had to deal with the protests. Now, keep in mind, this is what has been suggested in the other evidence from City of Ottawa officials. She said no, she didn't know that, and that city officials hadn't told her that. The commission then looked at a chart of deployed officers from the OPP and RCMP to Ottawa, and on February 12th, their chart shows a large increase in OPP and RCMP officers. There's a screen grab of that chart that was tweeted by journalist Alex Ballingall, who's live tweeting all the commission hearings. So I will link to that in the description below so you can look at the chart yourself. When asked about that February 12th increase, Deans testified that at that point, the command center had integrated OPP and RCMP into the command structure, and the, to quote, logjam had broken and they were freeing up more resources. She said that this trend increased and continued until her term as chair ended on February 16th. So this is interesting to me, in my opinion, because the increase of police officers obviously began and was ramping up before the Emergencies Act was invoked. So this officer resource issue that we're being told was causing police, making police unable to clear the protesters, it looked like it was being resolved as of February 12th, that this logjam, that it was being cleared. So if that is one of the main management barriers to clearing the protests, and it was resolved or was being resolved by the 12th, why was the Emergencies Act invoked on the 14th? Another thing that really stood out to me was when the Commission Counsel asked Ms. Deans if she knew that the police board can make a request to the OPP for assistance. Did they ever do that? She was asked, and she said she does not recall. That's also interesting to me and relevant to the issue of whether all legal tools were actually being used, which is, of course, the requirement under the Emergencies Act. There was also a lot of evidence today that I might describe, in my opinion, as petty political infighting at Ottawa City Hall. It wasn't necessarily relevant to the question of the Emergencies Act justification, but a lot of time was spent on it, so I'll tell you about it. For example, Ms. Deans testified about the short honeymoon for Police Chief Sloley after he was hired, and that there were rumors about Sloley's management style and a lot of infighting within Ottawa Police, including what she called a bit of an insurrection going on within Ottawa Police and an attempt to use the crisis of the protests to undermine the chief. She also testified that she heard rumors that people on Ottawa City Council were trying to push him out. There was also a CBC news story about Sloley and his leadership, and the board, in response to that story, Ms. Deans testified that the board looked at dismissing Sloley. They concluded that they did not have authority to remove the chief, but they had the authority to suspend him. Their concerns all rose out of these allegations in that CBC story. A lot of time was also spent on the issue of Dean's decision to hire another police chief after Sloley had resigned as chief from outside of the Ottawa Police Services, and a disagreement that she had with the mayor over what happened with that hiring. The nature of the disagreement, honestly, it's not that important for the purposes of the Emergencies Act. A lot of time was spent on it though. The disagreement was basically that other witnesses like Serge Arpin and Mayor Watson said Ms. Deans tried to do this hiring without delegated authority from the board, and that Deans had told Watson, they testified, that she wouldn't sign the contract without his approval, the mayor's approval. There was actually an audio recording of evidence related to this that was admitted today to the commission. It was an audio recording of Dean's conversation with the mayor. She described the mayor's testimony as inaccurate, and that is why this audio recording was admitted. There were actually some objections by the Ottawa Police Council over the fairness of admitting a document so late. It was admitted this morning. I'm not especially concerned with any of this part of the testimony, but ultimately the recording was played in the commission. Deans testified that she recorded this because, to quote her, she did not trust the mayor. And in the call, which they played at the hearing, she told the mayor that she had picked this short-term new acting chief who would start in a few days. The mayor was surprised and told her he didn't support it. She defended the decision, but told the mayor if he didn't support it, she wouldn't sign the contract. Then the call got really awkward when she asked if there was a non-confidence vote coming for her. The mayor was pretty evasive and told her that he didn't know. And then when Deans asked him directly if he would support a non-confidence motion against her, he was again kind of evasive and said that he hadn't decided. It was pretty awkward in my opinion, but this is, again, in my opinion, and it's also just not really relevant to the question of whether the Emergencies Act was required. It just seemed like a lot of small level petty politics and disorganized management at the city, which of course is not at all related to the threshold of the Emergencies Act. On cross-examination by the lawyer for the Ottawa residents, Paul Champ, Deans said that she was angry when she heard that the RCMP and OPP deployment was delayed over concerns about the Ottawa Police's operational plan. That's the evidence that had been given in previous hearings by City of Ottawa officials. She testified that she thought the Ottawa Police Board should have known that the plan wasn't satisfactory so that they could ask the police what needed to change in the plan so that they could get those resources. She said the board was only being told very high-level details about the operation. On cross-examination, Deans was asked if the police could have removed the protesters with a court order if they had had the resources, and she testified that she didn't know. A lawyer for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms asked Deans how the tension between her and the mayor, if it interfered with the resolution of the protests. She said that everybody needed to be on the same team, and it wasn't a problem just with her and the mayor. And listening to all this evidence about information shared with the City of Ottawa and not shared with the police board, she said that was an example of not everyone rowing together. And she's also said that the tension was not just between her and the mayor, it was also between Slowly and Bill Blair and many other people who were just not working well together. On re-examination, Ms. Deans was asked if the board had enough information to exercise their oversight function, and she testified that they'd have been able to do a better job if they'd had more information. She was also asked if the mayor had interfered with the board's autonomy by directing her, the chair, on the issue of hiring a new temporary acting chief. She said that the mayor fell short of directing her, but that the mayor and council came very close and that the mayor had made a bunch of public comments that also are concerning. She called it all very close to the line. She was asked if the mayor had put undue pressure on her, and she testified that she understood the consequences of moving ahead with her pick for acting chief. It was pretty clear to her. Recall that that was the conversation where, after telling the mayor who she wanted as acting chief, she asked if he was going to vote against her in a non-confidence motion, and he wouldn't say, and he said he hadn't made up his mind. So the consequences were clear to her. But she said that she has a job to do, and she has to do it to the best of her ability. And if she has the most information and is acting in the best interest of the community, she needs to do that and not be unduly influenced by what she described as political pressure. Okay, that's all for Ms. Dean's testimony. Let me know below what you think. Do you think there's a lot of time being spent on stuff that kind of doesn't really go to the question that we all want answered? Because in my opinion, that's the feeling I get. Next up was OPP Superintendent Pat Morris. He testified about something called Hendon reports on strategic intelligence. As of January 21st of 2021, he said that these reports were being disseminated to 9 police service chiefs, and this included Ottawa. He also gave very interesting testimony about the planning and intelligence that existed and was shared before the protests arrived in Ottawa, that in my opinion makes Ottawa look pretty bad. Remember, we've been told by a number of witnesses, including Ms. Deans this morning, that the Ottawa police believed the protesters would be gone by Monday of the first weekend and maybe Wednesday at the latest. So Superintendent Morris was asked what the OPP intelligence understood about the timeline of the protests and how long the OPP believed the protesters would stay. Superintendent Morris said as of January 20th, which is before the protests arrived in Ottawa, they at the OPP thought there were a lot of unknowns that made them think the protesters would stay for a long time. The OPP did think it would be a long-term event, and by long-term, Superintendent Morris testified that meant a plan for maybe 2-3 weeks or a month. As of January 22nd, he testified that OPP intelligence concluded it was almost certain, to quote, that the convoy would disrupt traffic on highways and at borders. When asked why he thought this, Superintendent Morris testified that because the protesters had made comments in earnest, the various grievances that they'd expressed had been expressed for months. People were willing to go further to demonstrate the lengths of their dissatisfaction over issues. He gave examples of pediatric vaccination, employment consequences for vaccination status, the vaccine passports, and he testified that all of these things increased the frustration of the people who were planning to protest. Superintendent Morris also testified about the money that the OPP was watching the convoy collect through GoFundMe. He testified that the money spoke to the support for the cause of the protests, which he said they knew was widespread. He also added concerns about how the money would be used, whether it was on food, fuel, and accommodations, and that this could mean that they would stay longer term. His biggest takeaway was from the money, he testified, was about how it meant there was widespread support and how the protests, it could make them last longer. Superintendent Morris also testified that there was no evidence that the protesters would be armed and that there has been a lot of hyperbole around that. There was no intelligence, he said, of a January 6th type situation. And it was noteworthy that he testified that when coming across Canada, he testified there was basically no reported criminal activity from the convoy. He testified it was actually conspicuous for the lack of criminal activity. However, he testified that there were concerns from OPP about what would happen once the protests got to Ottawa because it would meet head-to-head with Ottawa's police plan. He testified that protests can also attract other elements, people not necessarily connected to the cause of the protests, and people like lone wolves. That was one of the things he said that the OPP was concerned about. He testified that protesters are generally looking for legitimacy, they care about an issue, and they believe in it. He testified there was also intelligence at the OPP about the number of trucks that they expected and the fact that they not only had large commercial vehicles like semis, but also heavy machinery, compressors and tractors and things like that. And he said he shared all of this intelligence widely, including with the Ottawa police. Superintendent Morris was asked if he was concerned about what was being done with this intelligence being the expected length, money, and resources of the protesters by the Ottawa police, and he testified that he wasn't involved in Ottawa planning. But he said he wouldn't know if any planning was being done based on intelligence because his job is to stay in his lane and produce the intelligence. And in OPP, they had responded by creating a major incident management group to plan for themselves. Superintendent Morris was asked if he observed anything to suggest that the intelligence was not being actioned by Ottawa police, and he said he wouldn't have any way of knowing this. He assumed that they were planning, but based on evidence now, we know more about Ottawa's planning. So at this point, we know that the OPP had significant intelligence about the protests, which had been shared with Ottawa police. But then on February 10th, which was well into when the protests were underway, Chief Slowly asked the OPP for all of these intelligence reports, these Hendon reports, since their inception, so going back like 2 years. Superintendent Morris testified that this was surprising to him because he said Ottawa and Chief Slowly actually already had all of these reports, and he didn't understand why Chief Slowly was asking for reports from a year ago that obviously were not relevant to the protests that were happening in real time. On February 11th, he met with Party from the OPP, who was of the opinion that Ottawa's planning was not being led by intelligence. Now, this is all really interesting, and in my opinion, it makes Ottawa look bad, but obviously it's all backwards looking. Once the trucks were there, the lack of planning isn't super relevant to the question of whether the Emergencies Act was justified. The question becomes what can be done about the trucks once they're there. What legal tools exist to deal with the situation? So while in my opinion, it looks pretty bad for Ottawa, it's not speaking to the question of the justification for the Emergencies Act. The one piece of testimony that could be relevant was an intelligence report from February 7th. This report talked about the, quote, potential national security threat from the convoy. Superintendent Morris testified that this was about specifically the move of protests to the border, the Ambassador Bridge, Coots, and the long-term plan to stay in Ottawa. Superintendent Morris talked about how he spoke to CSIS about this, and they did not see the intelligence the same way. They did not see any intelligence that reached their threshold in terms of something that is a national security threat. So OPP, he said, was an anomaly in even calling it a potential national security threat. He said that there were significant discussions around this, but that he was okay and content to call it a potential national security threat. Potential. There was another February 8th intelligence report that also raised this potential national security, and in this case also sovereignty threats. Superintendent Morris testified that this to him basically was the same thing and it related to the borders. And he said he agreed that the situation had the potential to be this kind of threat, but he was very clear that this was about potential. It was not an actual threat. It was a potential threat. And that his opinion was actually an outlier from other agencies like CSIS. And on cross-examination, he confirmed that there was never any concrete, actionable intelligence on actual threats. I hope this summary has been useful for you and informative. I'm going to do my best to keep posting them. I asked yesterday if you find them valuable, and the comments were so kind and nice, so I appreciate your positive feedback so much. I'm going to do my best to do a summary tomorrow as well, although it might be only for part of the day, because in the evening I'm going to be attending an event downtown, an award for my friend Adrienne Batra. She's receiving an award from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If you're interested in attending, there's still tickets available. I think they're $25. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to this channel and to our email freedom updates at theccf.ca/freedom updates. And of course, I always want to thank our donors who make all of our work possible, including our participation in this historic inquiry. You can support our work by making a tax-deductible contribution at theccf.ca/donate. Okay, that's all for this update. Thanks for watching, and let's keep fighting for freedom in Canada.